Hello. So this video, we are going to be discussing the function notation. So we're going to talk about the sort of declaration of a function and how that works, as well as the sort of rule and what that means. And we're going to cover the f of x notation. Okay. So language of functions. So there's two parts to a function. The first part, the declaration of the function. Second part, the rule of the function. So we're going to tackle each of these things sort of separately. So the declaration looks like this. So we give this sort of letter here, f, a colon, and then this r, little arrow bit, and r. So all of these letters, the f, the r, and the r might change. So the f part, that's the name of the function. So if you're thinking, say, f of x, that f is the name. The first r, that's going to be the domain. So that's the stuff that we're going to be putting in. And the second r is the codomain, the stuff that we're taking out. So again, that first bit, the name, the f, that's what we call the function. Now, technically speaking, the name of the function is f, not f of x, even though that's usually how we sort of say it, sort of casually. For the sake of this class, I'm going to be, or at least this sort of set of videos that I'm in, I'm going to be using f of x sort of interchangeably with f when I talk about functions. But some professors in other classes may be very particular about this. So just know that that's a thing. And if it comes up, ask your professor about which one they sort of prefer. Okay. That first r, like I mentioned, that's the domain. That's the stuff that we can put into the function. So that's the sort of valid things that we can evaluate. And that second one is the codomain. And the codomain is the type of thing that you get out. Now, it's sort of important to note here that there's a difference between codomain, the type of thing you're getting out, and the range, the actual values you get out. But there's sort of a nuanced thing about why we care about making that difference, and we're going to cover that in a separate video. So for now, I'm just going to say this is domain and codomain. What exactly sort of means with that is something we'll cover elsewhere. Okay. All right. So the next up is the rules. This is usually what people think of when we think about sort of declaring a function, even though the declaration is that sort of previous bit that tells us the context of what's going on. The rule tells us sort of how the function manipulates things. And in general, we write this thing using the f of x notation. So we say f of x because f is sort of our dummy function, but it could be f of x, g of x, whatever it is. It's this bit over here, right? And then we have this sort of what you probably think of when we think of function. So for example, we might have something like x squared plus 1. Now what the f of x notation does is it sort of establishes a dummy rule, meaning that this x over here in the of x piece, right, this is f applied to x. And what that's saying is whatever the input is, we're going to call it x for a second. And then what the rule is that we take that input, we square it, and then we add 1, okay? But the important thing here is that x here doesn't necessarily mean anything in particular. It's sort of the placeholder that we use for whatever we're trying to evaluate the function on, okay? So then you might see something like, okay, where does f take to, or where does f send to, right? There's usually this sort of connotation of like f picking something up and bringing it elsewhere. So here, when we say where does f take to, what we really mean is that we want 2 to take the place of that dummy variable. We want 2 to take the place of this x. So we would, right, we want the output. We would then put the 2 in place of x. And what that means, right, so over here we see that we've replaced the dummy variable with 2. And what that means is everywhere on the other side, right, just like up here we had the x and the x squared, everywhere on this side of the equal sign, anywhere we see an x, we replace it with whatever we're plugging in, right? So since we're plugging in 2, everywhere we see an x, we replace it with 2. So it becomes 2 squared plus 1, which we can then compute and get 5, okay? So the important thing is that these things match. So if we're putting in an x, everywhere we see x, we replace it with whatever we sort of replace that with. If we put in something else here, we would replace everything on that side, right? Everything that there's an x, we replace it with whatever we put in. So let's look at some examples. Hopefully this sort of makes sense in practice. So let's say we have a function f of x, and that's taking that dummy variable x and making it x cubed minus log of x, right? So it takes whatever the input is, cubes it, and then subtracts the log of that thing. So we could put in whatever here. So we could plug in 3, right? So which again, this 3 over here is declaring that that's what we're doing. We're saying, okay, we're evaluating f at 3. We're plugging in 3. That's what this side is declaring. And then this side is actually doing it, right? So everywhere where there's an x, I put in whatever I've declared, 3. So I get 3 cubed minus log of 3. And again, this is anything. We could put in other functions. We could put in a smiley face, right? It really doesn't matter. The only thing that is sort of important is that you're consistent, right? So if we're putting in a smiley face, everywhere where that thing had an x, we then put in a smiley face. So smiley face cubed minus log of smiley face, right? That's the point of the f of x notation. And this is something that we're going to be using a lot, pretty much constantly throughout the rest of the math classes you ever take, right? It'll be throughout the entire rest of this course. And if you move on to calculus or another class, it'll be entirely through that one too. So this is really important to sort of sink in really well right now, okay? All right, so what did we do? So we went through and talked about sort of how functions are declared and what the notation is, right? So we declare a function, right? We give it the context part by giving the name, then the colon, then the domain, arrow, codomain. And that whole domain, codomain, range thing is sort of subtle. We'll talk about that in another video. Then we have the rule, the part that you sort of probably think of when we think about stating what a function is, but that rule is about that f of x notation. It's about sort of giving you a dummy variable that you can then use to plug in sort of with that expression on the other side. Okay, so that is that.